What exactly is Italian espresso? What makes it stand out? What makes it really good? And what topics should we discuss today?
Nella tazza fumante si svela il segreto. Benjamin e Philipp lo assaggiano perfetto. Un viaggio di sapori profondo e sincero. Un'arte creata con amore e mistero. Un rituale d'amore, una danza perfetta. La macchina ruggisce, la tazza è pronta. Mandorle, cioccolato e spezie fragranti. Ogni goccia è un segreto che il tempo avvolge. Espresso italiano, poesia in tazzina, caldo intenso, una dolce...
Ciao ragazzi. For the second time since the year 2019, exactly 5 years ago, we have already done this once before. We created a video, just the two of us together. We asked ourselves, the top 10 Italian espressos, are they good or burnt? It was a bit cheeky.
It was a bit cheeky, it was very intense. We tasted our way through and then published our results, presenting everything on an Italian map. Sketched it out roughly by estimation. For this particular year, we've decided that we're going one step tougher this time. Instead of 10, 20 espressos chosen by the community and then brewed meticulously by an expert. Since there have been a few critiques,
There were criticisms.
we take those.
Exactly. So one thing was, we didn't prepare it correctly. We once brewed it on a Nuova Simonelli, maintaining a constant temperature of 93 degrees. Always 18 grams in and I think 45 grams out, so brew amount in the cup. And there was a lot of criticism. You can also read about it in the comments. It was really so in your face at times. It was partly, I would say, justified, but also very emotional. Without a doubt, it truly motivated us to undertake the process once more. And we brought in 2 brewing experts, 2 experienced extractors, from Naples plus Stuttgart.
Antonio Nurri himself, unquestionably a Neapolitan coffee demigod in every sense, has just arrived here. Machines. He develops machines and he also roasts espresso.
And he roasts the machine in, yeah, exactly.
Naturally, it was very important for us and truly made us happy. So many thanks yet again to Gianni Marzinotto, who also joined us. He made it to the finals of the Hamburgers Championship and is not only known for his great passion and love of Italian espresso, but also as a true expert, an exceptional barista. And the both of them were primarily responsible for the recipes. And with that, we have basically, the coffee, brewing quality and expertise completely outsourced. Were we able to really focus on testing it out? Could they also increase the amount and temperature of the espresso?
Yes, so you could say that there exists a certain protocol that is followed. So it's about 7 grams of coffee, boiler. Pressure set at around 1.2 to 1.3 bar, but naturally it all depends. In northern Italy, the coffees are not roasted as dark. In southern Italy, they are roasted much darker. And typically the proportion of Robusta is somewhat higher in southern Italy compared to northern Italy. And for instance, in the city of Naples, where people consume copious amounts of coffee on a daily basis, the lever machines continue to be a key reference point. So the machine is specifically designed for use in bars. That's why you will notice there are some subtle differences. However, when it comes to preparing a perfect cup of coffee, one principle remains constant. You need at least 8 grams of coffee for each cup. Regarding the water temperature, it can vary between 90 and 95 degrees, depending on the type of coffee we're preparing.
And we've added or integrated another level, namely double blind. What exactly does that mean? Well, we received 20 coffees from you that we absolutely had to taste. We received over 2,000 votes, over 2,000 responses came in. We then created the top 20, but we only tasted 19 because one coffee didn't arrive. So it was just 19, but it was enough for a day. Double blind meant that Damien from the roasting team, he took the coffees, labeled them with a code, and then made his own code. And he then gave this bag to Gianni and Antonio, and they didn't know what was inside either. Benjamin and I had a taste as well, and only by the end did Damien disclose all of what it included.
Exactly, and we also did some tasting, and then of course we'll get to that maybe a bit later. We also looked at raw coffee, among other things. No, not raw, but roasted coffee, much more robust. And that's really important because otherwise I would say the color of the roast or the quality of the beans can still provide a helpful clue or indication. We did not do that. We initially tasted, then entered our results, and finally recorded our detailed comments. And then we analyzed the green coffee beans. No, actually the roasted coffee beans. Philipp, what were the specific criteria that we checked against?
So we had sensory criteria, but we also had the physical ones. So physically, like how do you see it? How does the roasted coffee quality look? The second was the oiliness. Why is oil significant, or perhaps not? The more oil that is visible on the surface of the coffee beans, the higher the risk that the coffee could turn rancid fairly quickly. Every oil turns rancid, even coffee oil. That can lead to the coffee getting really rancid, and that would be a shame. So we assessed that on a scale from 1 to 5. 5 means the coffee shows a lot of oil, so it has a higher risk. That coffee quickly turns rancid. The roasted coffee quality, meaning the bean quality, we've seen things like Quakers, which are unripe beans. We've seen breakage. There are 2 different fractures, so either the coffee is very dark roasted, there were a few candidates for that, and if the bag gets pressed like that, it can happen that they break apart. However, there are also defective raw coffee beans that are already broken because they are of lesser quality.
Exactly. It actually depends on the roaster and what they purchase. There's a formalized list of so-called defects. And we really adhered to those guidelines and then took a closer look at how many are actually present. And as I mentioned before, that's a decision, an intentional choice made by a roastery. I purchase a certain quality. Because it aligns with my coffee, or because it stands for what my brand represents. Or because I want to stay true. Or because staying true is possibly a reason.
We often found things exciting in the sensory categories because we also expect them to be present in coffee. For example, the bitterness. And bitterness is not inherently bad. So we distinguished between a good bitterness and a bad bitterness.
We already had very good espressos today. And this one was, for me, rather very, how shall we say, as it is. For me, it wasn't such a good one, or rather a bit of a bad one.
A nice bitterness. It can be soft and pleasant. You might know this from Aperol drinks or similar. That can be a beneficial, positive component. However, it can also be quite nasty and unpleasant.
We also oriented ourselves a bit, I would say, on the tasting sheet from the Robusta grader, which always deals with bitterness. And it's about the same question there. And we applied that to the acid topic as well. We looked at a balance of the acidity and a qualitative acidity that is integrated or not integrated or stands out. We carefully evaluated it once more, and if this specific acid, which was possibly present, was well integrated, we would therefore rate it even higher. We used the same method to evaluate sweetness too.
Then it's about body and texture. Those are 2 things. Body is weight, and we assumed that many of these Italian coffees genuinely have more weight, therefore quite a lot of body. Yet you can also get body by dosing heavily. That was indeed a notably strong espresso you made for us here. There's still a lot of coffee in there, a bit less water, very good. The other thing is the texture, and the texture doesn't describe how good, soft, gentle, velvety, silky, creamy, or whatever the feeling is of this body. And those are 2 different things, and we wanted to separate them, and so we made 2 categories. I can say many coffees had a very heavy body, but few coffees had a very smooth texture. Absolutely. And that leads us to a 3rd parameter we looked at, which is the aftertaste.
How does this entire mix of acidity, sweetness, bitterness balance, and of course body remain available, accessible, and positive in the aftertaste? Or do certain components end up overshadowing others? Maybe, for example, the bitterness develops more negatively and we experience dryness, or also that what we initially perceived as a pleasant texture may suddenly turns biting. We would evaluate that in aftertaste, and we've done that intensively, Philipp, with all coffees. We're about to dive into our expansive coffee panorama. It was incredibly wide. And yet, perhaps we can share a conclusion right at the outset. It's a story that we learned, which was incredibly fascinating and exciting for us, partly because we approached these coffees with a certain expectation in mind. And then we had to discover what exactly constitutes Italian espresso.
Sure, we asked what a classic Italian espresso really is. We're still unsure even now. We had a feeling that the coffees might actually be roasted a bit darker than usual. That the coffees also contain Robusta, and sometimes quite a lot of Robusta. However, we've also encountered the opposite scenario, so we even reached out to you to send us the ideas, what you think about traditional Italian espresso. Then a vote was held, including our community. And these are the coffees that came out, and 2 or 3 I would never have expected. No, I never actually said or even implied that we're doing a classic Italian espresso tasting. No way. The coffees had a lot of acidity. They were super aromatic. One was really floral, like I snuck in some Ethiopian coffee or something. Things I wouldn't have expected. And we then learned, oh wow, this feeling, so classic Italian espresso is, I believe, much more a feeling than a clear definition.
Yes, especially as these weren't merely individual opinions. From a sizable pool of 2,000 voters, these have emerged clearly as our top cafes. And they have usually received over 60-70 reviews. So those who have now made it into the finals. That is quite extraordinary.
One has received more than 280 reviews and it still managed to do quite well. You definitely have to say that was absolutely amazing.
We don't want to keep you in suspense any longer. That was basically the prelude. 19 espressos we tasted in the end. By the way, we didn't say it quite correctly. 18 were chosen by you. 2 were nominated. One was from Philipp of Vittora, who also runs a YouTube channel and is an Italian coffee enthusiast. And we asked him to nominate his favorite or preferred coffee for this round. One that should not be missed. He also said why he thinks it's great. You'll find it attached at the end of the video. And I believe he's somewhat seen as our essential rock or cornerstone here.
The Swiss Antonio Nurri,
the legendary figure of the Swiss Barista Championships, the accomplished 6-time Swiss Barista Champion Giovanni Meola.
I believe that Giovanni was likely competing in Barista Championships well before they even officially existed. He probably helped to get it started, but everyone in Switzerland knows Giovanni. And maybe it's also known in Germany and Austria. But Giovanni also asked me, hey, what's your tip? Which coffee is a must-have? And it went in a flash, and he said 2 things and then specified once again, no, it's the coffee that has to be there. And we made sure of that.
Let's start with the winning coffee, and don't worry, there are several other coffees coming, we'll discuss them, but the winning coffee tasted as follows to us.
So that was a coffee, 8 and 3. I really enjoyed that one. I tried to push the scale to its limits and gave it the highest score once.
5 score.
What do you mean precisely?
Probably up there, sweet acidity or aromatics, so flavor complexity.
Not even once, I was only at 4. But indeed, I smell and I just notice, okay, there's something else in there. And I thought, floral notes, I immediately think of Ethiopian coffees or something. I was really quite surprised by that. It doesn't have anything to do with a traditional Italian espresso for me, and found it very complex. So in general?
Yeah, I've been going back and forth quite a bit, to be honest. I noticed that as well. I saw, wow, there's definitely something floral there, and mentally, I was already halfway imagining myself in East Africa. But then I reconsidered, and I really delved into it, ultimately rating the coffee very highly. It stands out as my second best choice here, even throughout today's tastings. He then actually, while I ended up scoring very high on the taste balance side, I did have to reduce the score in terms of heaviness. Since it wasn't heavy at all, it was really quite light. Illy Classico. It's quite intriguing, isn't it?
Did you expect it?
A bit earlier on, I was actually making fun of all those cans. Yes. So we blind tasted again.
And we were not alone, because Antonio and Gianni also participated in the tasting. However, we didn't include their course, but they were in part very, very similar to our course. So we were actually 2 + 2 in tasting. What does that mean? It means many things, that Illy won here with the Illy Classico. It is also said that there is really very high quality here. And that as a very large company, maybe exactly because of that, you simply have a certain level of professionalism and truly a quality department. It makes sure that the coffee consistently tastes the same. And that coffee also appears with you. Really stood out significantly. That was one of the coffees with the highest number of votes where you mentioned it's a classic Italian espresso. But I didn't find its aroma genuinely classic.
Not at all. So, that was this particular coffee, the one where we discussed the floral notes and ended up being genuinely surprised. I could envision many possibilities in that regard. Indeed, I could even picture espressos from the specialty segment being part of it, all without knowing which particular roastery was behind them. We obviously saw that in the ground image too, Philipp.
We've noticed a slight amount of sweat, I'd say approximately halfway up on our oiliness scale.
More breaks.
Yeah, actually a bit of breakage occurs. But those are just things that tend to happen after roasting. In this stage before roasting, It's genuinely quite fascinating. The beans are all, yes indeed, if it weren't for this breakage, a rather uniform shade of brown. Well, the coffees likely will not be too different regarding their lightness, so that they roast similarly. It reminded me of a washed coffee from Honduras with a caramel note and maybe a little something from Ethiopia.
Well, we might get more citric acid perhaps, but
Let's see. What we saw there is very consistent. So we didn't have any defects like Quaker or Broca. And regarding bitterness, when we were analyzing the main attribute, we described it as a pleasantly well-balanced form of bitterness. That was really very pleasant. The coffee has a bitterness, but it's very smooth and enjoyable. I liken it to something akin to a Campari, something truly pleasant that absolutely entices you to desire another sip. The weakest attribute was the body. But we said, body is really just the weight. So if you want, you have the option to increase the body, but the texture, meaning the quality of the body, was exceptionally great. And so we have named our winner of the second edition.
write to us in the comments.
Your thoughts.
We can't help it. We tasted blindly.
Next time, in 5 years, we'll do a top 30, and you'll need to bring more coffee if you don't like these results.
Sure, we were just a two-person panel, a two-member jury, always shaped by our personal experiences, and you could say perhaps these coffees were quite close to what we drink daily or more frequently. However, we do have to mention that much darker interpretations have actually performed very well in the assessments. Number 2, however, was definitely still somewhat more akin to what you'd compare to the Illy version. Great coffee, man.
Something different from before. I thought the coffee was here. It had a lighter creamer, indicating it wasn't roasted as dark, which reflected in the taste too.
I actually wrote down quite a few notes. First, I found it very sweet, I found it caramelly, I found it very smooth, pleasant aftertaste. Then, to me, it had a positive pipe tobacco-like note. Actually, I found here dried fruits, good balance, and in the aftertaste, I had licorice. So I actually went through the points very well.
Manaresi Gran Bar.
Indeed, it's fascinating, Philipp. 2, and we could already hint at 3 as well. It's not all that fatty in terms of body. Nonetheless, on the one hand, it is quite soft and has a good texture, which provides a pleasing balance at that point. In addition to this, it is relatively complex regarding the structure of its aromas. Has the 3, top 3. Best, but she really excelled there. And we were right at the top with the scores.
The top 3 were really close together. Manaresi came in second by just half a point. Yes.
'Cause of you.
'Cause of me, maybe, already punished, but fine. But they also left. The top 3 have really pulled away. We have a sort of medium dark roast here. We're just beginning at the start of the second crack. We can already observe a few dull beans showing up. Nevertheless, the coffee has a distinctive acidity. They're indeed quite distinctive, not just due to the roasting process, but also because of the many washed coffees present here. Large bean washed coffees like these that introduce this delightful acidity component. Let's take a look at number 3. Omkafè Diamante. Such beautiful packaging. Everything truly sparkles brightly. Many have excelled, that's another topic, we'll look at it later. But here, we rated the aroma spectrum the highest. So we could really smell and taste a lot. I found that interesting. 482 is the second surprise for me today. I'm jumping right in. I rated the coffee very highly. A standout aspect for me was the texture, influenced by both the roasting process and the quality of the raw beans. I really hope that when we take a closer look at the beans, we will indeed see that too. But the roast is really well chosen. I found the coffee smooth and pleasant. I did observe that an oily texture was present. I truly liked that a lot.
I found it sweet too. It had an elegant, balanced acidity paired with the sweetness. It's really super pleasant, more like a rich, dark caramelized sweetness. For me, it especially has a pronounced nougat note. But I also experienced roasted almonds and similar flavors. I was in that area.
I wrote about the entire spectrum of brown sugar from end to end. So if we really look at this flavor map, at this aroma wheel as well, we see, hey, it's exactly roasted almonds or caramel of this kind. And it was always perfectly balanced, never overwhelming. I believe the roasting was very well chosen for the types of beans included.
Beautiful bean pick.
Yes, that's exactly what I meant, hopefully. We'll see what we tasted. It's not that large beans are automatically superior simply because they are large in size. Sometimes it just appears aesthetically pleasing, but above all, they are extremely uniform here. So we have a variety of beans here, but they are all approximately the same size. This certainly simplifies the roasting process, as beans that are all the same size tend to develop more consistently compared to having a mix of very small and very large beans. The roast level is specifically set to be medium dark, exhibiting small, oily spots that start to appear, likely emerging just before we reach the beginning of the second crack. But it truly balanced really well. There's a bit of Robusta included in here too, not a large amount, but you can notice it in this droplet-like shape. Additionally, it seems likely that we have some naturals included here as well. These most likely could be coffees from Brazil when assessing their taste. Perhaps a few more? Exactly, plus some washed coffees. In my opinion, the blend, along with the fact they're quality coffees, is important. That's what we meant by texture, that a coffee is smooth and enjoyable, requires quality relaxation coffee. I truly enjoyed it here.
Was it once again a typical Neapolitan, or was it actually something different entirely?
I think you could say that. So it was very pleasant. Indeed, this is an exceptionally fine coffee that you can thoroughly appreciate and enjoy after finishing a delicious and satisfying pizza.
Only after a great pizza.
In Naples. Yeah, I really enjoyed, a standard smart. So I think that was definitely a good coffee.
Philipp, those were all the coffees over 20 points, so they've set themselves apart. And then there's a larger group that follows, which I would refer to as the midfield. It definitely shows some similar characteristics. But let's take a moment to listen to what our detailed taste description sounded like. I find this interesting, Philipp. I'd say it's another very dark roast. Extremely dark roast. But I'm quite certain it's a better raw coffee profile, so I'd stick my neck out now because I possess a much nicer and a much softer texture. I have a fairly heavy body. I find the aftertaste completely fine. And above everything else, I would definitely rate the bitterness much more positively. Are you all set to take a little peek inside the bag?
Certainly it is 8, 3, and 4.
It's actually not that dark at all. And it's also quite a consistent and steady image of beans. Please take a look at it, the sizes, Philipp.
Seem a bit oily?
Yes, not really that much.
I do happen to notice a few more that seem quite robust.
40-50 PCT, yes.
But also the raw coffee quality. Now let's take a look at the breakage. We saw quite a bit of it with the others, but here it's noticeably less.
An outstanding Italian espresso or just an ordinary coffee? What's your final verdict? Is it a blend? Is it a blend?
Well, I would say 4, 6, 5, yes. It basically meets my idea of an Italian espresso. Everyday coffee, let me tell you something, and I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here. I think it's most likely a grade 2 natural Robusta from Vietnam. This coffee has a distinct quality with an unrefined and rough taste that stands out. Maybe it's from Tanzania too, I'm not quite sure, but something a bit unclean, something like imparts a spirit-like character, you know what I mean? Similar to how red wine that has been aged for a long time in a wooden barrel takes on this kind of spirited, distinctive character. I actually find it quite tasty in here, as the roast is also a bit darker, so dark, and somehow it works quite well. It gives the coffee its character. This coffee was very similar. It gives the coffee character.
That one is heavy. Had a lot of dark chocolate. Bitterness was quite pronounced for me.
Yes, I found it very heavy, but I didn't find the texture very pleasant. I found them a bit dull and somewhat dusty. And they had this slight nasty acidity in them. For me, it wasn't a quality acidity, but more like just a sour element that was present. And that really bothered me a lot. I didn't find it especially pleasant.
I actually consider the kind to be much sweeter. That's exactly why I ended up giving the sweet-sour balance a rating of 3.5.
It had sweetness, but the acidity seemed off. So I'm rating the balance a bit lower.
I wasn't into the aroma spectrum. I'm mostly into dark chocolate, especially if it's caramelized.
So what we actually always had here was relatively much body and very little aroma spectrum. And that, I would likely say, is the true classic Italian espresso for me, especially if we're going by an intuitive perception or sense of it. So there were few surprises to the left, right, up and down, but the coffees were mostly solid, with quite a lot of body. Some had a significant amount of bitterness, at times pleasant, yet other times it was not. But the roasts, they were all pretty evenly dark.
A few of them were somewhat darker, whereas others seemed a little bit lighter. But yes, it is also a phenomenon, not merely a roast level, but instead a variety of different roasting languages, on one hand on the roast color level. On the other hand, we have also seen even in this area already that we have different roasting effects.
We observed a variety of roasting effects. Certain types of coffees were, we might say, baked, so they've been roasted for a long time. That affects the texture. The coffee feels a bit hollow. You might describe other coffees as being roasted very quickly at high temperatures, and they're actually a bit sharp, so they really have this unbalanced acidity and still a lot of bitterness. But there was no coffee in the large central building that I would recognize. That's why I find it interesting. I think with this kind of coffee, there's a lot of emotion involved. I'm vacationing, passing the Gotthard and Brenner Pass, and I always get a coffee. Yes, there's definitely emotion involved in it. Still, I really couldn't recognize any mid-range coffees just by their taste alone.
However, we do have, and this is of course also a differentiation from certain types of coffees and roasts that we, perhaps in Switzerland, at times in Germany or sometimes in Austria, we consistently have a full-bodied experience. We have weight, and especially then of course there as well, but also here now in the tasting, which by the way Antonio has prepared on his beautiful Lever espresso machine. We had this body. The body was present. And that was of course partly because of the brew ratio, but also because of the coffees.
As for the recipes, we handled that, with Antonio and Gianni creating individual ones, and they link those in the blog, so you can see the brewing process and try it yourself. The recipes aren't fundamentally different. Yes, now we can debate again whether the coffee is good enough for you to have a miniature bring you this coffee. What is the dosage? How long is the extraction? And how much water does it need? So mainly the temperature. You said you're taking a temperature, and we were heavily criticized for not having done it in the proper and correct manner. Now, the two have both agreed on it, and let's just go ahead and take that as the standard. The recipes, such as the amount dosed versus what ended up in the cup, may be deviated around 20%, but surely not more than that.
Yes, absolutely. So that was quite apparent, but the coffees were always tasted by you once more before they made their way to us? Yes.
At least one extraction we did, and then adjusted and then gave the first fitting at the earliest, the second, usually the third.
Exactly right when the two have said, now it tastes good, now it's right, now the coffee is just perfect. We extracted everything there was to extract. Naturally, if you're working with an espresso at home and happen to have it for several weeks, you might be able to draw out even more flavors from it, be even more precise. But I would say we have really tapped into the potential of these coffees across the board.
Let's take a look at the end of the table. So why are there some coffees that have dropped off? It primarily relates to an extremely high level of bitterness, and a kind of bitterness that is genuinely unpleasant. Again, briefly, there are bitterness levels that are high but pleasant, and there are those that are really quite scratchy. And then, partly so roasted, such that the coffee really just ends up tasting entirely like ash. And we don't feel anything at all anymore. Do the coffees have a lot of body? Absolutely, you can incorporate that. But it really, in the other categories of sensory quality, we gave very low scores. A relatively high bitterness that I would describe a bit as so. Gritty. Well, I don't find it a mild bitterness, but one that really lingers darkly on my tongue.
Yeah, you're definitely long and persistent in the aftertaste, standing out quite distinctly.
And it's just, it's entirely one-sided, like there's absolutely no left or right involved at all. So if you're looking for complexity, this is totally the wrong place. Simply, seeking a direction, this is the right place.
And perhaps once again, which aroma spectrum I also rated that somewhat poorly. It has a taste resembling turpentine and even asphalt to me.
Quite straightforward / rather simple. So there was indeed a noticeable heaviness with many dark notes and a lack of complexity. The texture felt hollow. How was it for you?
Definitely heavy, I'm on board with that. I even rated it a 4, then it significantly dropped in texture. So it was basically lacking a foundation, I would say. The aftertaste was quite bitter and more of an unpleasant bitterness. And that kind of carries through in the flavor balance for me as well. I honestly didn't really end up rating it very highly overall. It's quite interesting to me. On one hand, I thought the coffee had a mild, artichoke-like, vegetal bitterness. Initially, I found it positive, but in the aftertaste, it kind of fell flat, and the bitterness eventually turned a bit unpleasant for me personally.
And the bitterness really influences how we perceive something. It was quite noticeable. I noted a less favorable bitterness here, but I particularly found the texture to be rather unpleasant, the cooler the coffee got.
So, these are coffees that indeed contain a great deal of bitterness, and we truly experience the full force of that intensity to the absolute limit on that day.
This coffee is a rebellious coffee. I truly believe it's a rebellious coffee, standing against everything that's presently regarded as the pinnacle of good coffee today. I believe it's mainly a methodical approach to prepare coffee that way. So essentially, it's a very dark coffee with an abundance of pronounced bitterness, with absolutely zero acidity whatsoever. And then I genuinely think it's not even considered an approach to try integrating elements surrounding it at all. I'll go on briefly. Sadly, the aftertaste seems nasty. Reminds me of stone meal. Not that I always eat stone meal, but it has something mealy, dusty, which unfortunately stays on my tongue quite a while. It had such a harsh, chalky bitterness to it. And perhaps I'd like to delve a bit more into the aspect of the sweetness before I let you go. But it's when we look at sweetness, how you can roast. So there are light sweets, like white sugar, brown sugar, then caramel-like, honey at some point. But eventually, the sweetness fades away, and then it becomes charred. So this is roasted so dark that there's really no sweetness left. Only the short extraction suggests something like sweetness and texture. But there's actually nothing left in the coffee.
What is your opinion on the thought of allowing our two ambassadors to Italy to share a few words with us?
The valued envoy?
Kind Sir Antonio, what exactly are you going to say about all this?
What I'm saying? Well, it was quite intense and rather strong, you could say. So I think it's a very true-to-form Neapolitan coffee, with a distinct and strong identity, you could certainly say. I believe in Naples you truly find an excellent espresso at the bar. Personally, it felt just a little bit too strong for me.
Philipp, and those are coffees, and I really wish that you could, of course, criticize us here and tear us apart and so on. Those are your favorite coffees. We did our best, and these are our honest opinions, and as mentioned, blind is challenging. There were also many coffees. I would still like to ask you something, namely, even if you say your coffee perhaps didn't do as well. I would be really interested to know whether you drink it with or without sugar, because I believe that especially this pronounced high level of bitterness, in combination with this full-bodied texture, works differently with sugar, as sugar helps to add a balance to it, and I find that really quite exciting. Feel free to write to me or to us in the comments below, and we also have why.
We also asked Antonio. Antonio drinks coffee with sugar or without at the conference. It was clear, no, without sugar. Would you drink coffee without sugar? Indeed, always without sugar, always without sugar, always without, despite being in Naples.
Many people these days, perhaps less so often, but years ago, it was almost impossible to enjoy a bitter coffee, like without adding sugar in full. In some spots, you still need to specifically ask for coffee without added sugar. I have to say amaro, meaning bitter, without sugar, because there are still very traditional bars, like at stations, that actually offer the sugar first, because extraction, the key doors. Incredible. But today is a bit different, but you could say that in Naples, many people still drink with sugar.
And then I find myself wondering if the sugar, much like the small cream portion or the Kreml in Switzerland, where we tend to add a bit of cream or a touch of sugar, is actually used to gloss over certain things. Where does that come from? I'm also interested in the history of adding moves. Was that making a virtue out of necessity, or is it appropriate, and if so, where are the sources?
Philipp, if we take a closer look at the bottom of the table now, the information from the raw coffee clearly speaks for itself.
You could express it quite starkly. If we place bad quality raw coffee into the drum, then inevitably poor or even worse roasted coffee emerges. No roastery uses bad raw coffee, roasts it, and ends up with better coffee. So they just cut corners with the raw materials. And surprisingly, there were a few coffees, even in the last third, that sold for a high price. And it's not about the raw coffee quality, it's truly about the feeling and the branding. And it's okay if that works. The problem is more in a comparative analysis, in a raw, hard comparative analysis. When we arranged the beans side by side, a few coffees at the far end of the table scored really poorly, with a significant number of defects. Really, it's partly scorching. So we already experienced a particularly hot roast with these black blisters appearing all over, the coffee was probably roasted for a longer period and at a very high temperature. We have partly brokens in there, which means defects, and once again here, coffee beans, insects that have gnawed their way in here. In our conclusion, I personally have learned a tremendous amount, finding myself often caught off guard or pleasantly surprised. So let's gather and summarize a few of these key points. First of all, is Italian coffee always dark roasted?
No, definitely not. We're here in a very wide range of medium roasts, actually with a tendency towards light up to very, very dark roasts. Yet we do indeed possess a detailed overview of various and diverse parameters. So we don't have a single roast language, we don't have a single roast color, we don't have just short or just long, but we really see a totally heterogeneous picture here. What about Arabica Robusta?
So there's no clear line here either. However, in the top 3, they were all Arabicas. There were others that had a lot of Robusta in it. Many had just a little bit of Robusta, like between 20 and 40%. However, having a higher Robusta amount isn't really a standard here. We genuinely found it intriguing that certain coffees emphasized the Robusta element, and especially if it was a high-quality robust one, and that tasted really good. The woody, heavy traits, along with the pleasant bitterness, were clearly at the forefront here. But there were also coffees that really didn't have any high-quality Robustas, and that resulted in a nasty, winey, so an unpleasant, fruity aftertaste. But also no clear tendency whether Arabica or Robusta. The question of high versus low-quality Robusta is current, and we've pondered it for a long time. Both of you are Robusta graders, and we proudly offer a pure Robusta because it constitutes more than 40% of global coffee production. And we really enjoy diving into that. We've been doing this for years, and we also noticed there's truly a trend, since the focus is now more on Robusta, that a lot of low-quality Robusta, which is still around, is simply marketed as high-quality coffee. And that's where the math doesn't add up. Arabica Robusta, so one is about taste, but the other is also transparency. And now we're opening a barrel, and now it hurts a little. Do we actually know what's inside? Arabica versus Robusta?
No, so we absolutely need to emphasize that these roasteries are all operating in a manner that's quite traditionally inclined. And by traditional, I mean that 20 years ago, I was actively searching for a coffee roastery that would be willingly open to telling me exactly where the coffee they roast, or at times over-roast, originates. There was a complete lack of transparency, and we can now say that at 19, or if we consider 18 and a half, the situation is remarkably different when we explore websites or review the packaging available. Precisely like that. So we might still have some coffee growing regions, including certain places from Asia.
From a top coffee region globally, it has received awards. They still remain vague. But the Arabica-Robusta ratio is only visible on one.
A coffee, but we did order it somewhat special or in a different way too. It even came with an instruction leaflet.
Exactly. So it wasn't on the packaging, but it wasn't on the website either. There was indeed one though. The delivery note included a slip that detailed exactly where the coffees come from. It was listed as 4 unique coffees. The Scugnizzo from Maisto, showing where the coffees come from. So that was neatly listed, and that was the only coffee or the only roaster that actually did it. Everything was thoroughly and neatly listed, and to be truthful, it was genuinely the only coffee brand or roaster that did it in this manner. Verify with third parties, but it's these labels. At present, that's the only instrument we have to determine, is it truly sustainable, and can I verify it? No coffee product currently has such a label.
Yeah. And I think that's just outdated. So at least that's my aspiration, that's my value system, that I want to know for as many products as possible where they come from. And with coffee, it's truly not an issue whatsoever. If this kind of information isn't communicated, then one has to start asking questions like, well, where does it actually come from? So why is it, one might ask and probably say, being kept so quiet?
It's kept quiet, and even if the recipe's not clear, it allows me as a roastery to say, okay then, I'll substitute now, since coffee prices have gone up. I'll take another one, I can save again here. In the end, it's for saving reasons. I see no other reason why roasteries would do that if they don't specify where the coffee comes from at all. And I just find that totally anachronistic, like just completely ignoring all the sustainability aspects and focusing only on a feeling and a heritage, an Italian nostalgic heritage of coffee. To prioritize that and totally dismiss sustainability, I find entirely anachronistic. Yes,
But on the other hand, it really works remarkably well. It continues to work even today and is gladly consumed and widely appreciated. And so, even to this day, roasteries have successfully managed to cultivate and maintain a lasting and iconic image of the classic Italian espresso around the globe. Even though we have to state our result today, both in terms of sensory perception and the facts when we analyze the coffees precisely, this picture doesn't actually exist.
So now I have a simple wish for all roasteries listed here, or those not included. There's a fact, and I can understand, so I can relate when certain people say, no, we don't disclose the origins of our coffees. But something else that really bothers me is the roast date. So very few, less than 3/4, indicated when the coffee was roasted. And that's just no fun for anyone. Not for us, not for you, for nobody, when you really get an old, stale coffee. It's just not enjoyable at all, and we keep seeing people come to us and mention that the coffee shoots through the portafilter so quickly, and usually it's simply because the coffee is way too old.
Yes, so that's not an exaggeration. We get 30 to 40 comments, questions, and messages per day with big concerns about whether the machine is still working properly, and it's not the machine. It's not the grinder, it's not the grind size, it's simply the old coffee. And of course, it obviously doesn't taste good, which I find to be quite striking indeed. And I genuinely have many significant questions about this frequent resale and dealer concept that those kinds of cafes tend to follow. They're just sitting somewhere at a wholesaler in Europe, in Germany or in Switzerland or in Austria.
You buy pallet wine. Pallet wine,
There's no roasting date available. And to be frank, every one of you can easily taste and notice that at home. After 3 months, every one of you will notice the sensory decline in these cafes. By decline, I mean specifically that it decreases significantly in its quality.
So, and everything we mentioned can also be found on the blog. You'll find the recipes and the coffee compositions if they were provided. You can find where the coffees come from, how we rated them, the dryness, and so on. It's intended to guide you. That's essentially the protocol we have followed. We made no attempt to sugarcoat it. It was a double-blind study, and we genuinely found it to be a lot of fun. And he told us, well, I thought that was really great. And maybe I would honestly be happy about 30 coffees in 5 years. Listen closely to how all of this evolves with those wishes getting fulfilled.
Dear Philipp, I agree, it was fun for 5 years. I'm up for another 30. I would say this day, this tasting has cost us 2 years of our lives. Because it really was also very, very tough. But we did it gladly. A big thank you once again to Antonio for taking the time to come by with your amazing machine. Had a lot of fun. Everything we learned about the lever machine also helped us advance. If you're interested in watching the video of Antonio and the Nurri machine, it's linked right up here. And Gianni, naturally, our beloved home barista fanatic, thanks for being with us here. That really made the day into what it ended up becoming.
Thank you for the selection, for your diligent participation. We have seen that this is truly a topic that resonates. And it's a lot of fun to just really get into action digitally. And that won't be the last time we do such activities. But it was a lot of fun tasting things we didn't choose. Would love to do it again.
Absolutely. Feel free to start immediately by making comments whenever you're enjoying a cool espresso and pointing out, hey, check it out, they included the roasting date on it. Or look, I really like them. It's an Italian espresso as well, not at all what we talked about today, maybe also about transparency. Or possesses a distinct flavor or is simply your top favorite choice. You can go ahead and nominate it now. And eventually we'll go over there, take a look and create a new edition. And yes, I'm really curious to find out what will happen and develop by that time. In the meantime, take good care of yourselves. We'll see you soon. Arrivederci.